Welcome back to a Slice of Empathy podcast. Today, we're diving into a conversation that so many of us can relate to. Joining us today is Gabby Wnek, a licensed clinical social worker, somatic experiencing practitioner, and chronic stress and anxiety coach with over 8 years of experience in the mental health field. Gabby specializes in helping high-achieving, anxious, and chronically stressed women heal their nervous systems and break free from unhelpful life patterns. Her mission is to empower women to create more choices, build a higher capacity for stress, and increase feelings of safety in their lives. In this episode, Gabby is going to share her deeply personal story of seeing 25 to 30 clients a week as a mental health therapist, hitting her breaking point, and finding the courage to put her mind and body first. We'll explore the science of the nervous system in simple terms, unpack the impact of burnout and anxiety, and discuss actionable strategies for setting boundaries and reclaiming balance. With her energy, passion, and vulnerability, Gabby brings a wealth of insight to inspire those who are feeling overwhelmed and chronically stressed to take action today and prioritize themselves. Get ready to learn, connect, feel, and be seen. Let's welcome Gabby to the show. I'm super excited to have you join our podcast. I was really intrigued by your background. I spent some time a little bit earlier today kind of perusing, just learning a little bit about you and your experience. So I think honestly, if we could just kind of start off by telling us and our listeners a little bit about you, your journey from being a mental health therapist to becoming a burnout and anxiety coach.
Yeah, so I went to college as a secondary education and biology major of all things. I come from a line of teachers, and my mom's a teacher, my brother's a teacher, sister-in-law, my aunts. Like, I have so many people in my family that are teachers, and I took the biology class and I was good at it. And I was like, what am I going to do with this? I actually don't want to teach. It's not the direction I want to go in, especially that like adolescent age. Like, it's just not my cup of tea per se. And I went undecided, but then I took a gen ed class. It was a psychology like 101 class, but it was taught by a sports psychologist. And I was like, oh my gosh, I love this. Like, this is it. Like, I want to do this, right? So I majored in psychology, and I did end up double majoring in psychology and social work because I was a really, really big overachiever. And I was like, okay, bang for my buck. Like, we're already paying for college. Might as well get more out of it. And then I wanted to do marriage and family therapy. And I went to look at a program at Northwestern and found out that it was going to be $96,000 for 2 years. And I went, yeah, no, we're not doing that because that's crazy expensive. So I went back to my department chair of social work, and she's like, why don't you just, get your master's? It's going to be way less expensive and you have the advantages of being a social worker. And I was like, great, awesome. And then during college is when I had chronic pelvic pain start. And that is kind of part of my journey as well. I graduated with my master's and I went into community mental health, and it was rough. I mean, community mental health is difficult in the sense that you have clients that have really big diagnoses, right? So you have anywhere from like personality disorders to bipolar to like clients that are really, really struggling. And I was struggling too, because I was in like the height of the pain that was going on. And so this kind of started my journey with burnout. Ended up quitting that first job because I found a clinic in California that I went to for the chronic pelvic pain, and they taught us how to meditate and do our own physical therapy. And it just became too much, right? Of this like constant own pain and anxiety. And then also like being a new therapist, a new social worker out of grad school. And I didn't really know what I was doing because you kind of don't when you first graduate. And that was kind of the cycle that kept going. I would go back to work and it would become too much. And then I would have to quit while I was trying to figure out what was going on with my body. And I ended up figuring out that it's mind-body pain. So it's neuroplastic. And so it is very much nervous system based, and didn't really know that until probably like 5 or 6 years into my journey. But really what happened at my last job was the part that really hit me. I was seeing anywhere from like 25 to 30 clients. And I remember having a regular client. He was a weekly client that I saw. And I remember just looking at him and being like, I don't care what you're talking about. Like, I really could care less. And I would love for you to leave. I didn't say this to him. This is what I thought in my brain. And I went, okay, this is a problem. Like, as a therapist, like, I cannot be thinking like this. And I knew that there was like
Yeah.
a bigger issue at hand here. And so I took a couple days off, but I knew that taking a couple of days off wasn't going to fix the problem because it was bigger than that. And it took me months, really, pretty much abandoning myself at that point of like barely eating, going to the bathroom, like barely having time for myself. I would come home with like 10 out of 10 pain pretty much every day. And the only thing that helped was taking a Klonopin. Like that was the only thing that helped. And I had to do that every single night. And it probably took 3 or 4 months for me to be like, Gabby, like enough is enough. Like you cannot keep sacrificing your physical and mental health for this job. Like it is not fair to me and it is not fair to clients to do this anymore. And that was when I quit my job. And I really took like a good 6 to 8 months to like really do like deep, deep healing work and to work with that part that I abandoned, right? And really work with her and to like give her a new narrative that like we're never going to do that again and really getting into the things that were triggering for me to be able to find coaching and doing therapy and coaching again. And so that's kind of in a nutshell, kind of my journey into what happened and then into the work that I'm doing right now.
Yeah, I applaud your honesty because when I was reading your bio, that's something that really stuck out to me. And it must have taken a great deal of self-awareness to really realize like, whoa, I really need to step back, right? So
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that with us because I think we all, I think at some moment or some point in our lives have dealt with something similar. A lot of people don't have the level of self-awareness to really realize that they need to step back. And I know
Right.
from myself, it's taken a lot of trial and error as is true for many folks. So I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And I also have seen that you at one point had 25 to 30 clients a week. What would that look like typically as far as scheduling? It's a lot of people to be seeing, I would imagine.
It's a lot. I was probably seeing anywhere from like 7 to 8 a day. So
Wow.
I'd probably see like 4 or 5 and then have maybe an hour and then see another 4 or 5. Like, I mean, it kind of just depended on when clients could come in and things like that. But I did that probably 4 days a week and then maybe had a couple on a Friday. I mean, I had a colleague that was seeing 40 clients a week and he was seeing clients from 9 to 9 and having maybe an hour break in between. And I remember him coming to me and he's like, Gabby, can I get your professional opinion? And I was like, yeah, sure. What's up? He's like, I'm starting to get back pain. And I'm like, yes, of course. You are not supposed to be seeing 40 clients a week. Like,
Right.
this is crazy. Like, the energy has to go somewhere if you're not working on it. Like, it's going to go into your body because there's only so much stress and anxiety and other people's trauma and things that you can handle at a time. We can't just keep taking it in without letting it out somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I'm thinking about like that type of like intense schedule, and he could tell me if this is true or not, but from my understanding that all therapists have their own therapists. Is that correct?
Not all of them, but I think
Okay.
a majority of us do
Okay.
because we have our own stuff, right? Like I had
Right.
a client once, he was like, so Gabby, you're a therapist, like you have everything figured out, right? And I looked at him and went, am I an alien? Do I like not belong on this planet? Like, are you kidding me? Most of us therapists go into being therapists because we have our own stuff. We have our own
Yeah.
issues we're dealing with.
Right. No, that makes sense because like I think we have to, in order to be able to kind of be in that space to work with others, like we've had to have gone through something ourselves, right? Like we can't have it like
Exactly.
all figured out, right? So yeah, no, that makes sense. And I kind of want to go back to the pelvic pain because actually this is something that I personally have experienced
Yeah.
myself. And I honestly didn't really realize the mental and physical connection
Mhm.
to stress and like how it manifests. And I want to say probably within the last 5 years or so is probably when I started kind of realizing that because we think a lot about physical mental health, but in like as separate entities and not
Yeah.
like, combined. And so For me, like it was probably, about, I want to say a little bit longer than that, about 6 years or so ago when I started having a lot of chronic pelvic pain. And at first I thought maybe it was a UTI or bladder infection, something like that. And I would go to the doctor, and I have been treated for UTIs in the past, as I'm sure many of us have.
Yeah.
But like I would go back and like, this is still bothering me. I'm still having pain, but then they couldn't find anything. They're like,
Yeah.
there's no bacteria, there's nothing there. And it was really strange because I would have this pain and I couldn't, for the life of me, figure out where it was coming from for,
Mhm.
at least a good several months, I want to say. And then I kind of learned a little bit more about something called cystitis or inflammation that is in the bladder. And I also have IBS for probably at least a little over 10 years. I've been struggling with IBS. And that's another thing that I realized, that there's a connection with anxiety when it comes to IBS. And so I think it's just so important to take care of our mental health, because it can kind of translate over into our physical health. It will manifest itself physically. And I think so many people don't realize that they're, taking on high workloads at their jobs, second and third jobs. And a lot of times people are trying to make ends meet, and it's understandable. But I think a lot of folks aren't really aware of how damaging it could be, not just mentally, but physically as well. Like all that stress and everything that we're taking on in our lives. And not even necessarily just at work, but with our family, our personal lives, things going on at home. I think there's so much that we underestimate.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, so much of chronic pain and chronic symptoms like that is mind body pain. It is neuroplastic pain. It is something called tension myositis syndrome, coined by Dr. John Sarno. Like most of us, if not almost all of us that have chronic pain, don't have a structural abnormality. There's nothing physically wrong, right? Like nothing comes up on scans, right? I mean, I'm sure you have. I've had every scan under the sun, and everyone's like, you're normal. I'm like, well, why am I in pain, right?
Yeah.
And it really is this culmination of like repressed emotions and chronic stress and anxiety, right? Like there's a therapist, her name is Nicole Sachs, in the mind body space, and she talks about having like an emotional reservoir. She goes, if we're not cleaning it out, eventually it will overflow and spill into the body because it literally has nowhere else to go. And so it then turns into physical manifestations of the stress and the anxiety. And I think people don't realize that this happens all the time. Like most people who have, IBS, Crohn's, all of these kinds of migraines, back pain, knee pain, all of these kinds, like this is all a manifestation of being overloaded, right? Like, and I know for me, it was like, there's a part of me that always felt like I had to work, I had to overachieve. And I really had to work on that part of myself and tell myself, like, no, like you can do enough. Like it doesn't have to be 25 to 30 clients. Like I can have 20 and still have enough, right? And so I think we're in this society where it's all about like producing, and like
Yes.
doing the most. And it's like, yeah, but this doing the most is making us sick. Like it is making us crazy stressed out. And then it's leading to physical manifestations that doctors don't know how to treat because they're not taught to look at these kinds of symptoms as mind body symptoms. They're looking at it through a physical lens, and most often it's not physical in that, it's not structural in that sense, right? It is very much a manifestation of stress, chronic stress that we're not supposed to be in as human beings over a long period of time.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because earlier this year, I read this book. It's called The Good Enough Job. And I believe it was by Simone Stolzoff. Great book. And the emphasis really is on what could be like the good enough job, right? Because we're
Yeah,
so ingrained, especially in the States, to produce, or be
right.
productive. You hear all of these different things about like, productivity and being productive. And a lot of people associate that with their inherent worth. And I know for me personally, of course, I've gotten caught up in that as well. I was laid off from a position that I had earlier this year. Thankfully, I've since found another one, but I was there for 8 years, and it was like almost like this epiphany. I was like, who am I? I spent 8 years with this organization, and I think so many of us associate our identities like with
Mhm.
what we do for a living. And there's an inherent belief that a lot of people are like, oh, we are like what we do or how much we put out or how much we produce. So I'm curious because you mentioned kind of like learning to kind of lean into that slowness, especially within a society that this really pushes us to do otherwise. Do you have any tips as to like how we can maybe navigate that and be more purposeful and kind of slowing down, even though like we hear all these voices that tell us to do otherwise?
Yeah, for me, it was really so like in therapy, there's a specific type of therapy called internal family systems, and they talk about these parts of us, right? And so one of the parts that I had to work with was my overachiever. It's this part of me that I've had probably since I was little, to be honest. And I just kind of was like this, where I always had to do the most and the best. And I really had to like sit with her and really like create a relationship with her and being like, hey, you're here. Like, what's going on? Like, what? Because really, those parts are trying to protect us in their own way and the only way they know how. And so I really had to sit with her and like let her talk to me and let her explain to me like why she's overachieving and like what's the purpose behind her. And then I really had to like create a new relationship with her and, in a sense, give her a new narrative and teach her that we don't have to do all the things, that we can do some of the things and still be okay, and how important resting is, because we can't, it's a cliche, right? Like you can't help others if you can't fill your own cup. Like it's very true. And being able to kind of sit in the slowing down, which is really uncomfortable. It was for me, and I'm sure it is for so many people because, like you said, we are just trained to do all the things, but you have to kind of just sit with those parts and give them a new narrative, but also just allow yourself to just do everything slower, right? Like I learned this technique of it, just like doing everything 10 to 20% slower. Like everything, walking, eating, talking, everything that we do, just doing it slower. Because that will turn down the stress response. Because when we do things really fast, our nervous system is like, oh, danger, danger, like something's wrong. But being able to kind of pause and slow down is a really good like first step, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because it kind of comes to mind, like my husband, for example, minor things, but like, I think many people can relate to simple things like probably traffic or getting stuck behind someone walking slowly or whatever. I
Right.
think we all have like these little pet peeves, but then like even in instances where maybe we're not even like, we don't have necessarily have to be somewhere, we don't have to necessarily be to work. And I found this in myself too. Sometimes I'm like working to kind of get things done quickly, even though
Right.
there's not necessarily like a deadline. And so sometimes I have to kind of pause and be like, well, what am I rushing for? Like,
Mhm.
why am I, and it does bring about like this anxiety. And so sometimes like, I know like with my husband, sometimes it could be a little bit frustrating because I'll ask him like, hey, like, what's the rush, because it's like, this anxiety of like, okay, we got to get there or we got to do this or,
Right.
even though there's like this invisible deadline, right? And it's just like, okay, but this is just honestly, it's making me anxious. And so like, why am I adding that additional burden to my plate? And I think so many of us like do this and it really just takes us to kind of step back. Like, what's the rush? Like, what,
Right.
and
Exactly.
yeah. And I think it kind of goes back to that, like that productivity. I think and myself included, I'm guilty of this, and packing our days just like so full.
Hmm.
And it just to try to like, okay, and when we have a day where maybe that on a rare occasion becomes like wide open, we feel like this need to, okay, I can
Yep.
get this done or I can get that done. And so it kind of like almost goes back to square one. And then when that day kind of like comes, I know for me, like if I'm overscheduling myself, I get all kinds of anxious. I'm like, oh my gosh, why did I do this to myself? And like, you kind of have a little bit of that like regret, right? And it's just like,
Mhm.
how would you maybe advise a client to kind of break out of that habit?
Yeah, I think it's really recognizing that I listened to a podcast, her Mel Robbins.
Yeah.
She recently did a podcast about like us being addicted to busyness. And I think
Yes.
it's so true. Like so many of us are addicted to just being busy, and we feel like we are worthy because we're, like you said, producing or we're getting things done. And I think it's just being able to notice that, like noticing when you want to do all of these things. And like maybe you just do one thing on your to-do list and then you take a break.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like leaning into, maybe sometimes it's boredom, but leaning into just being able to like relax and do something that you enjoy doing and like making that more of a priority, right? Of like whether you love to crochet or garden when it's crazy cold outside, or going outside for a walk or working out or like spending time with friends and family, like how can you incorporate more of that into your life? Because that in turn will fill your cup more so that you can be more productive, right? I think we realize that if we rest, like, oh, we're just wasting time. It's like, actually, rest is really important to give you more energy to do the things that you need to do. Because eventually, if you don't rest, like your body and your brain will burn out. Like, that is just what's going to happen. Because again, there's only so much that we can take before our body's like, okay, we're done, white flag. And so I think it's just being able to incorporate more of those things, flipping our mindset into like, this is actually productive, right? I had to learn that. I had to learn that resting is productive, but we're not taught that in society. We're taught that like, oh, you're wasting time or you're not
Right.
getting anything done. It's like, actually, you're actually getting more done when you rest than when you're doing all the things, because then you inevitably get tired at the end of the day when you're in go, go, go mode all the time. You're wasting more energy doing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I believe I listened to that same episode. I actually just found Mel Robbins' podcast, and
Yeah,
like I'm addicted. I'm really hooked. And
I love her. Yeah.
yes. And it's interesting because actually just a couple of days ago, my husband and I had a discussion about like working like, second jobs or even just like gig work, right? And it's something that I've kind of discovered personally, having worked multiple jobs consecutively. And I think, it really just can depend on the person, I think, to be quite honest. But I found like for me that when we take on additional responsibilities, like a second job in particular, and I found this while like in college too, like while working and going to school, like there's definitely a correlation between grades and working. Like, for example, when I was in high school and I started working a consistent 20 hours a week, I know that's kind of when I noticed my grades start to slip. And again, I think there are so many people that can manage like fantastic grades, or they can manage both jobs concurrently and have fantastic performance. But I feel like a lot of people are just quick to be like, yeah, just get a second job without really thinking about how that's going to really impact
Mhm.
your performance, your focus at your main job,
Right.
or school, or whatever it is, when we're trying to juggle too many things. And if we're wearing all these hats, can we really be giving like 100% of ourselves? I found for myself personally that if I'm working a lot of additional hours in addition to either like working full time or going to school full time, that the other tends to suffer, or maybe even both.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we have to recognize. And I was telling my husband this the other day because he was considering maybe some additional gig work, and he's new at his position. And so I really emphasized to him, I'm like, I know some people are just, they're fantastic at juggling both, but like, you want to make sure that, if you really love your job, you really want to put your all into this main thing rather than trying to do too many things at once. And then you're tired, you're overloaded, and we may not think about it, but it ultimately can affect our performance in the smallest ways. We can make the simplest of mistakes. And it's something that we have to give like a lot of thought to, especially in a culture where we're pushed to be productive and work more. And yeah, it's something that we kind of we're chatting about. So, and I advise anyone who might be listening to kind of give that some thought as well, if you are considering a second job. And again, I want to acknowledge that, everyone's finances are different, and financially you might have to, look in that direction. But if at all possible, I think we want to kind of limit that additional load that we're putting on ourselves, so we're not sacrificing maybe our relationships or our main job or other things that we want to prioritize in our lives as well.
I know it's so hard. I think with everything getting more expensive,
Yeah.
that we'll kind of have to, take
Yeah.
off, unfortunately, more. And I think I've learned that, or I am learning that if I don't have to, like, I'm not going to, right? Because I don't want to get to a point of that kind of burnout again, because I wouldn't wish that upon anyone. Like, it is not fun. It doesn't feel good to be in a state of burnout. And, I think so many of us are, but like you said, we just don't have that awareness or we don't recognize it because there's other factors. And I think it is important to kind of caution, can I handle this? Like, can I
Yeah.
objectively handle adding more to my plate? Because most often people need to take stuff off of their plates, not add more, because we already have so much going on in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of our plates are so full. And
Mhm.
many of us try to pack them as much as we can. And especially I think when finances are involved. And I would honestly urge anyone who's maybe giving some thought to, sometimes it's for folks who maybe just they want a little bit of extra cash. And I know for me, like what's been really helpful is to have that additional time. So I'm not running around like a chicken with its head cut off,
Right.
is to really like, are there things that extraneous expenses, maybe things that I can cut to kind of feel like I
Mhm.
have that little bit of extra cash? It could be like little things. And again, it just really depends on the person and what you're prioritizing. But, like subscription services, things like that, that we may not be using, little ways that we can cut back. So that way we're not feeling that pressure. Okay, I need to get a second job and so that sometimes I could take a little bit of time, but I would urge anyone who's kind of considering that to see like maybe what they could do to preserve the cash that they have coming in. But I want to pivot a little bit because you mentioned boundaries in your bio, and that's
Yeah.
like one of my favorite subjects.
Mhm.
And it can really be hard, especially I think when it comes to our work lives. Maybe we're, dealing with a boss and it might necessitate setting specific boundaries, or maybe it's close family members, maybe it's a partner or a close friend or what have you. Can you talk a little bit about boundaries and kind of maybe what that looks like in your practice?
Yeah, boundaries are so important. And when I work with clients specifically with burnout, we kind of figure out like what parts of their lives they're feeling burnt out in, and then what kind of boundaries that we need to set, right? I think sometimes people think that boundaries are very harsh and very abrupt, and they don't have to be. I think sometimes they do, like, for example, like in a way, quitting my job was a boundary. Like, I had to set that for myself. And like, they don't think everyone has to do something big and drastic. And I think it depends on what everyone is going through. I think sometimes boundaries can be like stating your needs, right? Like at a job, telling your boss, like, I need to work less hours, or I need to shift around my schedule. I need to take on less projects. Like, I can't take on that project right now because I have so much more going on, right? And it's the same thing with relationships, partnerships, or friendships of like, hey, I need this from you, or I have felt like this in this kind of relationship, whatever the thing is. I think it's so individual for each person in every situation, but it's really about, I think, figuring out like what you need and want, right? And then catering your boundaries around the needs and the wants and like how you want your life to look like. And then also having like self boundaries as well, I think is important. Of like, I had to work with that part of myself, like put my hand on my heart and be like, I will never abandon you again, right? I will never get to that place again. And this is what I'm going to do in order to not get us to that point. So boundary is like such a huge topic and it's so individual, but I think they're so important in living a life where it feels a little bit more balanced, I think, than sometimes it feels.
Yeah. And I think honestly, it can be really, really hard. I think, especially when it comes to work, because I think a lot of us have these voices in the back of our heads. Like, we don't want our boss to get upset. We don't want to get fired.
Right.
We don't want to get written up or something like that.
Mhm.
And I think there's definitely a way of going about doing it that's, professional, direct to the point. And if for
Right.
some reason that like you do face some sort of adverse action for standing up for yourself and you did it professionally in a professional way, you might, want to reconsider, hey, was this job for me? Right. And I know for me, I've gone through periods of probably even more recently, like within the recent years, of just feeling burnout. And it's interesting because I want to say my last position, actually, I went through a period of time where I felt simultaneously burned out, but also like, is this it? Like feeling like I just wasn't really like inspired. And there are parts of my job I really enjoyed, but I felt I was kind of ready for like the next step. I was starting to feel like I just wasn't being challenged. So I think it's interesting because a lot of people think that like burnout is associated with like, oh yeah, I'm just feeling like I'm over like in terms of feeling overworked, but I felt simultaneously burned out, but also not inspired, if it kind of makes sense, because I remember feeling like a lot of the time I was just tired, I was sluggish, and with my
Yeah.
current position, I feel like really motivated, really inspired. It's something new and different for me. I need to have like that challenge and have that purpose reignited. And
Yeah.
yeah, you'll see a lot of even like on LinkedIn, like advice from recruiters and whatnot, 10 signs of burnout that you might want to maybe change jobs or different
Mhm.
things like that. There's like a variety of like different things that maybe you could look for in terms of like, maybe is it time to make a change? And sometimes that's really hard because I know like for me, I was at my last organization for 8 years and that could feel so intimidating to be like, oh
Mhm.
my gosh, change. And it, until like
Yep.
for me, it really took getting laid off to really reevaluate. I'm like, okay, what do I want next? So I took a few months to really get that together. Like, what do I really want next out of my next
Yeah.
role? And like, what are my musts? Right. So it's really an opportunity for me to kind of formulate that rather than like,
Right.
this position seems stable. I'm kind of afraid to make a change. So I think now, like, even going forward, I feel like more motivated to just like, hey, if something's not working out, or if I'm feeling like maybe this isn't the right fit, more empowered to kind of make a change versus like feeling kind of like not stuck, but kind of in this rhythm to where like I'm afraid to kind of move beyond my comfort zone. And I know
Mhm.
so many people are probably in that scenario, but I think evaluating like how we're feeling throughout the day. And for me, it was like
Right.
manifesting and just like fatigue. And that was for me the biggest sign of burnout.
Yeah, and it sounds like that just like wasn't a good fit, right? I think a
Yeah.
lot of us kind of push past if we're not feeling good in a job. Again, it's kind of this like, oh, I have to. And I think when we're burnt out, it's very like tunnel vision. Like
Yeah.
our nervous system does not feel like there are other options, right? And
Right.
so kind of feel stuck. And so when I work with clients, we start to write down options, right? Because once we give our nervous system options, our nervous system is like, oh, I don't have to be here forever, right? And it gives you that like instant relief.
Yes.
And it doesn't always have to be like a big drastic change, right? Like not everyone is going to quit their jobs, right? Like sometimes it's switching departments at your job. Sometimes it's putting up boundaries, right? Sometimes like, it doesn't have to be like, oh, I quit. Because like our
Right.
nervous system doesn't like big changes because they're, like you said, getting out of a comfort zone. And our brain is always going to choose the path of least resistance because of survival and conserving energy. And so it's really like what are those options? Like, what can we change in your life to make things better? And it doesn't always have to be drastic. And like you said, evaluating if you hate your job, like there's a reason why you hate it and why you don't feel good in it. So let's figure out what you don't like about it and how we can either change it or do we have to choose something else that might be a better fit for whatever, whatever job someone is in.
Yeah. And it's interesting because like, I know for me, it's like we'll have these like little voices in our head saying, well, what if I move on and the next thing doesn't work out? So we'll have these like little things kind of like the self-talk,
Right.
that kind of in a way is kind of sabotaging us. And it's like, honestly, it's like for me, it's like, okay, maybe that's true. Maybe it doesn't work out. What if it doesn't work out? Right. And then it's like, okay, what am I going to do next? I'll find another position. And what if that works out? Right. And I think kind of approaching it as maybe this doesn't work out, but what if it does? Right.
Mhm.
And so like, are we missing an opportunity? And so it honestly, it could be like really hard. And I really like that you mentioned thinking about the different options because I think so many of us think it could be black and white. And I
Yep.
think
Exactly.
we're failing to realize that we have more options than we realize that we actually have in like a given period of time.
Yep.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. I just really want to quickly like reframe what you said about like the voice in the back of our mind is like there to sabotage us. It's
Yeah.
not. It's actually there to protect us. Everything that our nervous system does at the end of the day is to protect us. It just might not protect us in the best way, but it doesn't know how to do it differently, right? So like I love what you said of being able to like reframe that and being able to say, even if it doesn't work, we're going to figure it out. Like I will be okay no matter what. And I've figured out every other problem in my life. So therefore I can figure out this one tends to be like a great way to kind of reframe that. And then options. I mean, again, it's all about like what I like to do with clients is like have them write down every option, even if it's like the most unrealistic option, right? Of like best case scenario or worst case, like we just want to write all of them down and then we can start to work with like which option is going to be the best and might cause us like the least amount of resistance to change and then kind of work from there because like I said, we want to create at least some relief that I don't have to be stuck in the same place forever because things are always changing in our life. And the only consistent change or thing in our life is change. Like we are not the same people we were an hour ago or 5 years ago, or will be in 10 years or 5 years. And so just being able to like write down the options and figure out which one works tends to be really relieving for people right off the bat. And then we can kind of work on which is going to be the best option for people.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think it's also important to note that when we make the list of options, we may not necessarily like all of the options, but
Right.
it's still an option nonetheless, because I think
Exactly.
we feel sometimes powerless. And I feel like having that list of options can give us kind of like that power back. And I think so many of us like really struggle like with the lack of like control in a given situation. And I think it's like even a small way, it's just to kind of feel like we're getting some of that power back. Like, hey, we may not necessarily like all of these options, right? But just being able to see a list of options rather than this is what I have to do or this is what I can't do is so helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Control really is an illusion because we can only control ourselves. But I mean,
Sure.
it really does give us a sense of that control, right? Of like, I can do something because I have these options, right? Like, I'm not stuck, right? Because
Yeah.
we're only stuck if we don't do something different. Like, if we continue down the same path, then yeah, we're stuck. But if we create different options and scenarios for ourselves, then inherently we're not stuck anymore because then we have different paths to go down. And then it's just a matter of deciding which path is going to be the most suitable and the best fit for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually want to go back to parts therapy. You mentioned that a little bit
Yeah.
earlier. And within probably the last few years or so, I'm realizing there are so many different types of therapy. Like, I think so many of us are like used to like probably what's considered talk therapy.
Yeah.
Certainly the one that I'm probably most used to, but I'm really curious because I have heard a little bit about parts therapy, but can you share a little bit about that with our listeners?
Yeah, I'm no expert by any means. I just started a training recently. It's kind of this idea that we all have different parts of us, right? So we have what's called our self energy, which is it's not really a part of us. It's just like kind of like our essence and who we are. And that part is very patient and trusting and loving, right? Like this is who we are to our core. And then we have all these different parts of so the overachiever, the perfectionist, the people pleaser part, even addiction is a part of us, right? We have different parts. So something called like the manager part. So these parts are preventing pain from happening. And then firefighter parts of us, which are parts that will like if pain is happening, they're going to just take all of it out. And then we have what's called like the exiles, which are basically our deepest, most wounded parts of us, usually from childhood. So the parts that usually go through trauma or don't feel good enough, like those very core wounds. And so the idea is to really start to work with these parts of us, right? And really have them come up and let them show us who they are and how they're protecting us, and then work with them to give them a new narrative. Like we can never get rid of these parts of us, but we can work with them and create a new relationship with them so they're not as loud and they're not as strong within us, right? So they're not what I like to call driving the bus. My inner critic and my perfectionist and my overachiever used to drive the bus, and they don't anymore because I've worked with them enough where they're now sitting in the back of the bus, right? Like they're still there and they might come out every now and then, but I can react to them in a different way and being like, I love you. Thank you for showing up, but I don't need you anymore. Like I got this. Like I'm the one taking care of us now. And then they'll be like, okay. And then they'll go back to the back of the bus, right? It's a really cool way of looking at how different aspects of us work with us and just want to protect us.
Absolutely. That's so beautifully said. And I kind of want to go back to the manifestation of chronic illnesses that
Mm,
I was listening to this podcast episode actually with Gabor Mate,
yes.
and he's such a great figure in terms of mental health. And I was listening to this episode. It was mostly about like why women in particular tend to suffer with these chronic illnesses more so than men. I forget exactly like what the percentages were, but can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a huge expert in why this happens. I think may have to do with the fact that I think that women's brains tend to work differently. Like we tend to use more of like the right side of our brain. So like we're connected more, I think, to emotions. And I also think that, men in general, right? Like they tend to be more logical and left brain. And so I think there's a lot of like conditioning and societal conditioning as well. Like men obviously have emotions, but they're taught to be like big, strong, tough, right? And so they tend to like repress their emotions. But I think a lot of women do that too. And so I think there's a lot of like conditioning and societal conditioning about all of this. And I think for men, at least the men that I've worked with, we really had to decondition the conditioning of like, I'm not allowed to have emotions. I'm not allowed to feel emotions. It's like, yes, you are, because you have emotions just like everyone else does. And I think also women tend to, I think, societally bear a lot of the nurturing
Yeah.
that we do in our lives, right? Like we're mothers and we're wives and we're taking care of all these other people. And then so a lot of women's and mothers tend to be last on the list. And I think that has a lot to do with it. So I think there's a lot of different aspects and conditioning that gets put on both men and women. And it's really about recognizing this conditioning that has been put on us, that it's not really ours, it's more of a societal thing. And how can we start to reframe and decondition ourselves from these things and do boundary work and do parts work and do all these different things and really get back to kind of who we are without all of this societal conditioning that has been subconsciously put on us, most of us, if not all of us.
Oh my gosh. Yes, that is so true. Is there any maybe words of wisdom or words of advice you give anyone who might be struggling with any of these chronic illnesses or from burnout? What are a couple of pieces of advice you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah. One of my favorite quotes is nothing changes if nothing changes. So this idea of you got to do something different. And there is so much hope out there. There are so many people doing this work, and there is so much support available to people, whether that's therapy or coaching. Man, if I can do it, and I really think I couldn't do it. Like there was genuinely a part of me when I was going through all this. I was like, there's no way I'm getting out of chronic pain. There's no way that I'm getting out of burnout. Like I can't do it. I'm here, right? Like I'm like 90% better with my pain, not in burnout anymore. And I'm starting to see clients again in a very authentic way. It takes time. And the only way that you won't get there is if you quit, right? So if you keep putting one foot in front of the other and you keep doing baby steps, like you will get there, I promise. So many people have done this kind of work for themselves and they made it to the other end. And I think so can you. And I think it's important to hear that when you're really struggling, because it really does not feel like it when you're in it. But I promise you can get there. You just have to put in the work and you have to do something different every day in order to kind of get there.
Oh, absolutely. And I think so many folks can be intimidated when they think about like, oh my gosh, I need to change all of these things. And I like how you kind of broke that down into like starting off small, doing these small things. Cause when we kind of break it down into more actionable steps, it seems less intimidating.
100%.
Right. And so like, let's say for maybe you haven't worked out like ever, you can't expect to run a marathon tomorrow.
Right.
So you have to like break it down. And I think that's why like so many people get discouraged or like, and I know for myself included, I've been trying to write a book and I've been like the hugest procrastinator because like, oh my gosh, all these moving parts that go into it, right? But I
Right.
have to really kind of take it back to where like, okay, can I spend just 5 minutes a day writing something,
Exactly.
anything,
Hmm.
and like kind of keeping that rhythm because when you make it a habit, like, and it becomes habitual, you're more likely to do it, even if it's
Right.
these small moving pieces. Like you can't write the book in one night. So it really just can apply with anything that you do. It's just really breaking it down, so you
Hmm.
don't feel like you have to become a whole new person tomorrow.
Right. Right. I mean, it took me a year and a half to be able to meditate for 45 minutes. And I do that twice a day, every day. But I started off with literally 10 seconds a day because I couldn't do more than that. And that's what I tell clients to do. I'm like, start off with 10 seconds and then you move up to 15 and then maybe eventually 30 seconds. And then you get to a minute and then more. Right. But like, this is something that we have to undo so many years of conditioning, right, in order to create that new habit or that new skill, right? And it takes time, but like those baby steps eventually will turn into progress. Like that's just how it happens over time.
Absolutely. And before we kind of close out, can you tell us about maybe what's next for you? What's coming up in your mission to empowering women and spreading awareness about burnout?
Yeah, it's really just doing like so many podcasts and it's doing workshops and it's doing writing about it and just really getting the word out there so that I can, there's this quote of like, you can't change the whole world, but if you can change one person's world, I'm like, that's always kind of
Yes,
been, right? It's
I love
like,
it.
I'm one person, right? Like, can I change the entire world? Probably not, but can I change a couple people's world? Like, that's all that matters. If I can help one person, that's my mission. It's just being able to help the people that feel called to me and I feel called to them.
Beautifully said. And for our listeners who are curious to learn more about you, where can they find you, connect with you, learn more about what you do?
The best place to do that is my website. So GabbyWnekCoaching.com. I'm also on Instagram under Gabby Wnek Coaching as well. And then on my website, they can read all about me and how to work with me. And then also there's a free guide on there that they can access as well.
Awesome. I'll make sure I get those down in our show notes. But thank you so much for such a beautiful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I know our listeners will as well.
Thank you so much for having me.